these days to, if you can get 50, it's like I told Black Sails, I was their historical consultant. If, 50% of what I, factually told them ended up in the show, I was completely happy with that.
Absolutely. So when we're dealing with pirates, I'm going to throw some, I guess what we'll do is, let me throw out some names of some pirates, and just because I'm curious and I want to see if the image that you get in our culture or society today matches the actual pirate, or even if they really existed at all. And then I guess we'll Lorence or Mr. Little, you can kind of take us through a pirate history of sorts, and how pirates started, what happened to them, why we still don't see them up and down the seas now.
As Lorence knows right now, that would probably be about 50,000, half a million words to do a brief summary.
That's
it has taken a while.
That is not.
I mean, he 9 episodes, and he didn't even get out of antiquity. I mean, it's a vast subject. It's difficult.
Well, I'm sure, and maybe this might be something that we do. And we do this often with, especially our history episodes. The first time that we ever had somebody come on to talk about ancient coins, he had an idea that he wanted to do for an episode. He had slides that he sent in, and we had all of it uploaded and ready to go. And it was supposed to be a one episode thing. We're getting ready to do episode 5 of that one that started out with that first episode. So we do have a way of taking a subject and asking so many questions that it grows into something much larger. But you hear Blackbeard, Captain Cook, these names. Who were the real people, and are they anything like what they're painted in, whether it be movies or TV shows, that sort of thing?
Who do you want to start off on this?
Let's go with Blackbeard first.
No, I think he meant which of us do you want to start with?
Yeah.
Either one, whichever one.
You can go
wants to tackle that.
I'll add to whatever.
All right. So Blackbeard was a real person. Edward Teach, or Edward Thatch. But I think Woodard argued that it was Teach. So he was not all that different from how he's portrayed in movies, minus all the mythical stuff. He was a legitimately scary dude. People would just give up all their stuff without, him even having to do much, because it wasn't. Apparently, he had crazy eyes, if you guys know what that phenomenon is. People just looked at him and they were like, this guy is insane. He did this thing where he put like burning wicks in his hat, and it gave him the effect of having his beard lit on fire. So he had this ring of smoke around his head, which gave a pretty cool, scary. It's a pretty cool, scary effect. And he really did have the big beard. Maybe not as big as it was portrayed in Pirates of the Caribbean, but at least from the one drawing I can recall of him, it wasn't that big, and I don't know how accurate that necessarily was. But he was a legitimately scary dude, successful pirate. And his last stand, I think, is really interesting. Maybe we'll get into that later. But his recorded last words kind of resonate with me. Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarter or take any from you. And for those that don't know, quarter just means mercy. And I think that's really fucking epic. And Captain Cook, I think there may have been, some pirate named Cook. I don't recall, but I don't think that was anywhere near a real person.
Okay,
there were a couple.
More, let me throw at you.
There were a couple of minor buccaneers named Cook. unless you're actually doing some detailed research, you're probably not going to run across them. They're not something that the average person reading a couple of pirate books would come across.
Cool. One more before we jump into what makes a pirate a pirate. Captain Crunch. True or false?
Real, 100% real. Captain Crunch was there were many kings of pirates, but Captain Crunch was the emperor.
Yes, I have scars on the roof of my mouth to prove it.
So here's the next question. What's everybody's favorite Captain Crunch cereal?
There's more than one?
Well, there's like the original.
There's more than
Crunch.
one. I don't know.
There's the original Captain Crunch. Just the yellow pellets, and then there's the yellow pellets.
Yeah, we had the yellow pellets in the 60s. That was it.
Yeah, and then there's Captain Crunch with berries, which is the yellow pellets with berries. Then there's Peanut Butter Crunch, which is like the balls that are peanut butter. Then there's Oops All Berries, which are all berries.
You're breaking up
pellets.
Really bad.
What?
Your mic's breaking up really bad.
Yeah, it's
Do I
not really
sound like
poppy.
a robot?
Yeah, it's you might have to drop out and come back in to fix that. So let's go to Lorence or Mr. Little. Actually, we'll start with Mr. Little on this question. Where did the pirate, movement come from? Like, what did they spring from? What caused these men to spend all their time at sea raiding other ships and that sort of thing?
It depends on the period and who you're talking to and what researcher you're talking to. It's an old Greek historian a couple thousand years ago put it as a combination of need and greed, and it's pretty much like any other human endeavor. If there's an opportunity to take from someone else, they're going to do it. In the early days, piracy was probably indistinguishable from general warfare at sea. I suspect that it's been, more than 100,000 years. We have evidence that people were trading on the water by sea, and I suspect that piracy occurred along the same. It's need and greed pretty much sums it up, a combination.
Lawrence, anything you want to add on that?
I actually...
that was pretty much it. It really depends on the time period, because this is kind of my personal opinion on this, and scholars disagree on this. But when it comes to the sea peoples, for example, they were never referred to as pirates, and even the early pirates in antiquity, they weren't necessarily referred to as pirates. It was just a general term. In Greek, it's a listas, which just translates to like raiders. But then eventually they developed. I'm sorry if you hear my dog barking. Then it eventually developed into piratas. But when it comes to their motivations, it all depends on the period. And I know that I think Klein argues that the sea peoples, caused they caused the Bronze Age collapse, but I'm thinking they were like a symptom of it. So like it makes sense to me that in an already collapsing world where there's a lot of terrible things like drought and war, people would resort to stealing things. And in some of these cases, it was just migration that people took as war. But that's just my own personal thing. I kind of got off on a tangent there.
That's okay. Mr. Little, did you want to tag in on that?
Yeah, piracy basically is just unlawful or illegitimate theft at sea. And back in antiquity and probably pre-antiquity, it was just a method of warfare. As long as it was considered legitimate, it really wouldn't be considered piracy. And it's the same thing today. Privateering has been outlawed since the 19th century, but if you're stealing at sea on the open ocean today, it's still considered to be piracy. If you're a nation state that happens to be plundering or confiscating at sea, it may or may not be piracy. It's just simply a question. It's basically a fairly modern question of legitimacy, especially in the Golden Age, 17th, 18th century. Oh, go ahead.
You can finish.
17th, 18th. Yeah, so that's okay. 17th or 18th century. Basically, a pirate meant someone who lacked a lawful commission from, if you were European, from a civilized government. You could be a North African corsair, a Barbary corsair. You could be a Malayan corsair. Europeans might consider you to be pirates, although technically you were still legitimately privateers because you were commissioned by a lawful government. So basically, two ways to look at it. If from European status, if you have a lawful commission by a lawful government, you were not a pirate, you were a privateer. Or if you were from an uncivilized country, you were a pirate no matter what you did. I'm not speaking from my own personal point of view here. I'm just repeating the way people used to think.
Lorence, before I asked this question, did you want to add in something there a second ago?
Yeah. That it also, he kind of touched on it earlier, that it depends on who you're talking to, because if you have an English privateer stealing from a Spaniard, the Spaniard's gonna think you're a pirate either way. It doesn't matter. To the victim, the distinction really is inconsequential.
Okay. When we talk about stereotypes, I guess let's dive into these, because when you think of a pirate, and like for Halloween, there are certain things that people go to, markers of a pirate, and I'm interested to learn where they came from. So I've got a list of what I think are the most obvious stereotypical pirate I guess markings would be. And number one, there's the Jolly Roger flag. Where did that stem from? Whichever one of you want to.
It's a legitimate flag used in the early 18th century, but I did a lot of extensive research on this last book that I wrote. We don't ultimately know the origin of skull and bones on a flag. It's been used for centuries before pirates, but they did what we think of as Blackbeard and his ilk. They did adopt that in the early 18th century. It's entirely possible they adopted it from North African corsairs who were known to use it. There were old military units prior to this that had used it. But what was unique about it is that it was a black flag. We actually have an account of French buccaneers in 1688 using a red flag with no quarter with the skull and bones on it. But the black flag was definitely a legitimate. There's some debate on what the origins of Jolly Roger. It's not Joli Rouge, as some people say, meaning pretty red. There's actually no reference to that. That reference, I think, comes from Joli Drapeau Rouge, a mid-19th century French communist flag, actually. That's another problem, and I'm sure Lorence has run into this in his own research, is it's really hard to stomp down these stereotypes. It's sometimes almost impossible. You can write books on it, you can write articles on it, and people are still going to believe. You're still going to see books today talking about the Joli Rouge, meaning the origin of the name Jolly Roger. It has absolutely nothing to do with it, but it's really hard to tamp down on ignorance, and really, and especially when it's been appropriated by the culture.
Okay. Lorence, do you want to add in anything on that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's just important to note that many different flags were called Jolly Roger, even ones that were totally different. So like the skull and bones that we normally associate with the Jolly Roger, it's important to separate the flag from what we call it. So we have Spriggs and Bellamy and plenty of other pirates calling their flag Jolly Roger, and they all had different flags. So it is a really hard thing to point out. I know that at least the earliest I can personally think of as when we're calling a flag Jolly Roger and we're referring to the skull and bones, the earliest one I can think of for that would be Bellamy, because he did have the skull and bones, and he also they called it Jolly Roger. That's the early, and that was in like the early 18th century. So that's the earliest one I can think of. But it's important to make the distinction.
Excellent. Casey, do you have a pirate stereotype you want to throw out there and see where it originated from?